In this lesson, we'll be drawing a detailed line art using all the preliminary information we've gathered so far. We'll be going through this process by highlighting some of the key considerations you should have using the line art I've made. When starting a detailed line art like this, it can be really hard to know where to start. To start on any drawing like this, I identify 3 different priorities in order of importance. The first one is overlap, the second one is mechanical connections and joints, and the third one is body and shell shapes. The first point is especially pertinent when drawing traditionally. When approaching a drawing, even though it's a 3D object you are drawing, it is good to remember that the end result is a 2D picture. This means that objects that are in the scene but are covered by other objects should not be drawn and won't be visible. It might sound somewhat self-evident, but it is surprisingly easy to end up drawing a section and then realizing that it won't actually be visible in the drawing. So a good thing to break down in your drawing is which objects are closest to the camera and which objects are furthest from the camera. This then gives you a sort of order of objects that you can draw. For example, in my drawing, the firstmost object that I should approach is the arm, since it covers multiple parts of the mech. If I were to start on, for example, the leg, I would be likely to get carried away drawing the mechanics of the leg and realize too late that I've already drawn into the space that the arm is reserved for. After that, approaching the leg and then the hip section makes the most sense, and then the actual central body, since that will overlap the mechanics that go from the hips to the body. When you've done your build-up, it's possible that some of the perspective doesn't exactly line up as you are drawing it in full detail. So I like to prioritize parts that need to interlock and function together as the core things I would want to draw first. A lot of kind of shell shapes or body shapes that are built around it are very flexible to be moved and don't take too much effort to move. It also doesn't require as much perspective buildup to move a section like that, while if you were to have to move a complicated joint over, then it would be far more difficult. For that reason, I first want to make sure that those things are correctly drawn and fit well in the perspective, and then if I find any mistakes in the build-up, it is easier to adjust the rest around it. When drawing a mechanical detail, I would say that the most important thing to focus on is the core shapes that interlock with each other. I've always found that with mechanical parts in the design, drawing the logical structure of them and the way they connect actually already accounts for quite a lot of the overall detail that you will need. As you see in the connection with the arm, my primary concern as I'm drawing it is really how the different cylindrical rotation joints connect together and how they connect to the base and the arm, and I'm only spending a little bit of effort adding extra details on top of that. Given the complexity of the overall drawing and this specific part, I also did a little bit of extra build-up just to clarify this part. As an extra point, even though we've done a lot of preliminary sketches, it is somewhat expected that for some small sections, we might not entirely know what we wanted to do with it. Since I was working digitally, I've been able to erase and redraw sections quite a few times whenever I wasn't happy with them. When you are working on paper, a way that you can try and resolve these moments where you are not really sure what you want to do is to just draw in isolation that section on a separate page. For shell parts, I generally approach them as the aesthetic shapes that fill the spaces between my mechanical details. I focus on their overall shape and silhouette and then think about interior detailing that I can add as I work. The first step I generally do when I'm putting in these details is to focus on these outer edges and how they either cover or interact with mechanical sections next to it. While doing this, I think of some of the interior detailing I could add. A noteworthy point here is that it is worth to try and find opportunities as you're doing this outer edge for details that break the shape and break the silhouette. If you don't do this, you run the risk of all your details essentially being two-dimensional details, almost like a texture being placed on the 3D object instead of things that actually change the three-dimensional shape of your design. When thinking of how to detail this, my biggest consideration is generally manufacturing. A general consideration that applies most strongly here is thinking about the manufacturing techniques of your mech. You can get this kind of information based on the EFOS references that you searched for earlier. There will be certain styles of manufacturing that fit within the EFOS that you were thinking of, and trying to look at these references will help find detail opportunities for the outer shells. Specific things to look out for is how they break up plates and how things are fastened together. If you want a more realistic and in-depth result from the mech, it might even help to look up some of these manufacturing techniques online. With those 3 priority items covered, there are also some other considerations I want to bring up on my overall process and approach to doing a drawing like this. When thinking of how to fill sections with details, something I like to think about is function elements that I can use. For example, whenever you have a joint that has to rotate, you generally need a power supply connected to it. You might, for example, need cooling for certain sections, or you might need a supply of fluids to a hydraulic. You can look through a lot of references and start picking up on some of these kind of small details and ideas. And to me, they're sort of a library that I can use to fill in details where I want. If I know that in a section I want a lot more detail, I will first focus on things that are functionally logical to make details with before I would start adding any unnecessary detailing. You can see that I've used this in the leg. I knew that I wanted the outer shell parts to be quite clean and minimalistic, but then have the actual mechanical parts far more detailed. So in the leg, to fill some of the space, I actually put a power supply and cables connecting to some of the different parts. I also added cables coming from the hydraulics, which could be a supply of either fluid or power going to it. An overarching general consideration when I'm doing a detailed line art is I focus primarily on readability. To me, the function of the lines I'm drawing is to communicate the shapes and functions that I thought of in my design process. I don't approach them as much as an illustration like some other people do. For me, they are a communicative tool just to show these things. If you do want to use illustrative techniques, it can really help to think on how you want to use them and how they help your core goal of the drawing. In a drawing like this, we want to show the design of a mech, which means that if you want to use a more illustrative technique, does that illustrative technique actually help you to show and communicate the mech that you've designed, or is it actually working against your ability to show it? As a final part of this lesson, I want to do a quick recap of the entire course as it stands. What I focus most on in this course is the process of developing a design. The intent is to give you tools to think of ideas with and then develop those ideas to a point where they can make detailed illustrations later. In that line of thinking, this course has been set up to be repeatable. If you want to further hone your design skills, you should be able to go through the course again, just with different decisions or different intent. One important note regarding this course and the process shown within it is that for the intents of explaining things for the first time, I've broken up the function breakdown and aesthetic pass as separate entities. In this course, this is to give you a good exercise in seeing function and aesthetics as 2 separate elements. But in my actual design process, I would already combine these 2 things. For a future application, try and combine your EFOS thinking and functional thinking in the preliminaries together, instead of only looking at the aesthetics after you've already designed so much of your mech. With that being said, I hope that you enjoyed the course and that you've learned something new about the design process. Hopefully, the skills that you've learned in this course will help you develop more designs in the future.